January 1944. Northern Italy. Night is still clinging to the mountains when the first movement begins. The cold is sharp enough to bite through wool and canvas, turning breath into pale clouds that hang for a moment before dissolving into darkness. Below a rocky ridgeline, the valley floor is narrow and unforgiving, hemmed in by stone walls and winter-stripped trees. Sound carries here. A clink of metal, a low murmur in German, then silence again. At the crest of the slope, an Allied defensive position crouches behind sandbags and broken rock. It is not elegant. It is not permanent. It exists because it must. At its center sits a Browning M1919 machine gun, mounted low, angled slightly off doctrine, its metal dulled by use and cold. The weapon has been adjusted in ways the manual does not describe. Not redesigned. Simply pushed. Made to endure longer bursts. Made to hold longer than it was meant to. 2 days earlier, the idea had been dismissed. The barrel would overheat. Ammunition would run dry. The crew would collapse before the enemy did. On paper, every objection made sense. But now the valley is waking, and the first shapes are forming in the half-light. And with them comes the quiet understanding that this position will either break quickly or be tested far beyond what anyone believed possible. By the winter of 1944, the war in Italy had lost any illusion of speed. What began with optimism after the Allied landings at Salerno in September 1943 had hardened into a grinding campaign of stone, mud, and exhaustion. The German army, retreating northward but never collapsing, had transformed Italy's natural geography into a defensive weapon. Ridges became fortresses. Valleys became corridors of fire. Rivers were mined, bridged, destroyed, then fought over again. At the center of this struggle stood the German Gustav Line, a defensive system anchored on the mountains south of Rome. Even when Allied forces finally cracked it in May 1944, the pattern did not change. The Germans withdrew deliberately, establishing new lines farther north. Each withdrawal cost time. Each new position demanded blood. The Italian campaign became a war of attrition fought at platoon and company level, where terrain often mattered more than numbers. 4 Allied infantry units. This meant a constant state of tension. Advances were measured in hundreds of yards. A single hill could take days to secure. German doctrine emphasized counterattacks, often launched at night or at first light, designed not necessarily to retake ground, but to exhaust the enemy and test their defenses. These assaults were rarely large. A platoon here, a reinforced squad there. But they were persistent, probing, and dangerous. Machine guns sat at the center of this kind of warfare. In mountainous terrain, artillery support was unreliable. Guns could not always be brought forward. Fire missions were delayed by weather or broken communications. When German infantry moved up narrow approaches or through defile, it was often the machine gun that decided whether they advanced or died where they stood. The U.S. Army understood this in theory. Infantry doctrine emphasized interlocking fields of fire, mutual support, and the use of automatic weapons to dominate key terrain. But doctrine also assumed certain conditions: ample ammunition, regular relief, weapons used within specified limits. Italy violated all of those assumptions. Supply lines were stretched along twisting mountain roads. Units remained in the line longer than planned. Weapons were used not as intended, but as required. The Browning M1919 was everywhere in this environment. Light enough to be carried forward, powerful enough to stop an assault, it became the backbone of many defensive positions. Yet it was also a compromise weapon, air-cooled and vulnerable to overheating under sustained fire. Manuals warned against long bursts, against continuous engagement, against exactly the kind of fighting the Italian mountains demanded. As German forces regrouped north of Rome and prepared to contest every ridge and valley, Allied commanders knew the next phase would not be decided by grand maneuvers. It would be decided in places like this one: narrow approaches, exposed slopes, and hastily dug positions where a handful of men and one machine gun might have to hold for days without relief. And it was under those conditions that theory began to collide with reality. The Browning M1919 had never been meant to carry this kind of burden alone. Designed in the aftermath of the First World War, it was conceived as a flexible solution, a medium machine gun that could support infantry advances, defend fixed positions, and be adapted for vehicle and aircraft use. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, the weapon had already been refined, standardized, and mass-produced. It fired the .30-06 cartridge with authority. It was reliable. It was trusted. But it was also constrained by its own design choices. Unlike its water-cooled predecessor, the M1917, the M1919 relied on air to manage heat. This made it lighter and more mobile, but it imposed strict limits on sustained fire. Training manuals were explicit. Bursts were to be short. Barrels were to be changed or allowed to cool. Continuous firing was warned against, not as a suggestion, but as a certainty of failure. On the firing range, those limits made sense. On paper, they were non-negotiable. In combat, they were often ignored. By 1944, frontline infantry units had learned that the battlefield did not care about manuals. When German infantry attacked in waves, using terrain to mask their approach, machine gunners did not have the luxury of ideal firing cycles. They fired until the enemy stopped advancing, or until the gun stopped working, whichever came first. This reality forced quiet adaptation, not official redesign, not experimental testing, but small, practical adjustments born of necessity. Crews paid obsessive attention to headspace and timing, sometimes pushing tolerances slightly beyond regulation to maintain reliability under heat. Spare barrels were positioned closer, sometimes preheated by previous firing to avoid warping shock. Ammunition belts were staged for rapid feed, reducing pauses that could invite enemy movement. Mounts were altered for lower profiles, reducing silhouette and recoil shift. None of this was written down formally. It passed from crew to crew, learned in the dark, reinforced by survival, or by loss. German forces, for their part, understood the power of Allied machine guns and actively sought to neutralize them. Assault doctrine emphasized locating the gun, flanking it, suppressing it with mortars, or overwhelming it through repeated pressure. But in Italy's terrain, flanking was often impossible. Approaches narrowed. Movement slowed. Men were forced into predictable paths. Under those conditions, a single machine gun, properly sighted, carefully fed, and relentlessly manned, could dominate an entire sector. Casualties accumulated not in dramatic charges, but in short, violent moments when an assault met a wall of fire and collapsed under it. This was the environment in which the idea of pushing the M1919 beyond its limits emerged, not as a challenge to doctrine, but as a refusal to surrender ground simply because the rulebook said it could not be held. And once that decision was made, everything that followed became a test, not just of metal and mechanics, but of endurance. The story of this weapon, its crew, and the desperate ground they held can be understood through several lenses, each revealing a different facet of the same event. First, there is the human element. Machine gunners in these positions faced an almost unimaginable combination of stress and responsibility. They were exposed, often alone or in small teams, tasked with covering approaches that could funnel hundreds of enemy troops into a narrow kill zone. Every moment demanded vigilance. Every burst of fire carried a cost: fatigue, overheating, and the constant awareness that a single mistake could be fatal. Sleep was non-existent. Meals were often skipped. Fingers grew numb, eyes strained, and yet the gun had to remain steady, accurate, and lethal. From a tactical perspective, the position itself defined the engagement. The ridge where the M1919 was placed overlooked a narrow valley bordered by stone walls and dense vegetation. German infantry had to funnel through this corridor to advance. Artillery could not always reach them due to line-of-sight issues and terrain interference. In this context, the machine gun became the primary obstacle. It dictated movement, slowed assaults, and forced the enemy to attack in predictable patterns. The choice of firing angles, the use of overlapping fields of fire, and the coordination with other defensive positions amplified the gun's effectiveness far beyond its raw mechanical capability. Technological adaptation also played a crucial role. The M1919 was being pushed well beyond the design limits outlined in manuals. Crews improvised barrel changes under fire, used makeshift cooling methods, and adjusted feed mechanisms to maintain continuous fire. Every minor tweak, whether changing a barrel slightly earlier than recommended or positioning ammo belts for faster replacement, had a tangible effect on survival and efficiency. This was a weapon transformed by necessity, not invented. As the hours wore on, the battle's intensity revealed more angles, each emphasizing how extraordinary circumstances can elevate a weapon's impact beyond expectation. Leadership at the micro level became decisive. Squad and platoon commanders had to balance caution with necessity, often permitting or even encouraging modifications to weapons that formal doctrine would have condemned. These decisions were not about heroism. They were about survival, about holding ground that higher command deemed vital. The risk was calculated. A malfunction could be catastrophic, but inaction guaranteed loss. The enemy's perspective adds another layer of understanding. German infantry and officers were trained to identify, isolate, and neutralize machine gun positions. Yet in the confined valleys and ridges of northern Italy, many of their standard maneuvers were rendered ineffective. Attackers were funneled into predictable paths, making them vulnerable to concentrated fire. Reports from captured after-action notes indicate frustration and mounting casualties when assaults repeatedly failed, a psychological pressure that compounded the physical threat. The machine gun, in this way, shaped not only the battlefield but the enemy's behavior. The moral dimension of this engagement cannot be overstated. The men operating the M1919 confronted a relentless responsibility. Their fire alone determined whether the line held or collapsed. Decisions were instant and consequential. Each pull of the trigger carried ethical weight. How much force, how accurately, and how far could it be exerted without unintended casualties? The tension between military necessity and human restraint was constant, a silent pressure as tangible as the cold or the recoil of the weapon. Logistics intertwined with all of these factors. Ammunition supply was finite, resupply routes were exposed, and exhaustion set in quickly under continuous fire. Teams adapted by rationing belts, prepositioning spares, and rotating barrels with precision born of experience. Every adjustment reflected an understanding of mechanical limits, terrain, and human endurance. The result was a synergy between man and machine that allowed sustained defense far beyond what manuals would have allowed. Finally, the technological angle deepens when considering how the weapon itself became a character in this story. The M1919's air-cooled barrel, normally a limiting factor, was managed with ingenuity and foresight. Repeated bursts, careful pacing, and proactive maintenance allowed it to deliver sustained, lethal output. The modifications were minor but effective, a testament to frontline innovation and intimate understanding of the tool. It was not a miracle gun. It was a machine pushed to its limits by men forced to exceed theirs. Through these perspectives, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, moral, and logistical, the contours of the battle emerge. The single machine gun position was no longer just a weapon emplacement. It became the axis around which dozens of lives, decisions, and events revolved, setting the stage for the crucial turning point to come. Dawn broke slowly on January 12, 1944, revealing the frost-lined ridges of northern Italy in pale gray light. The German infantry had begun their assault shortly after first light, moving through the valley in small, deliberate groups. Their objective was simple: push the Allied defenders from the ridge and secure the high ground. What they could not know was how prepared the machine gun crew had become, and how every adjustment, every precaution taken over the previous 2 days, was about to be tested. The first wave entered the kill zone. The M1919 erupted. Its fire was controlled, disciplined, each burst measured to maintain rate while avoiding overheating. The air-cooled barrel smoked in the cold air, a thin ribbon that traced each long, deadly volley. Each round struck where it was aimed, cutting down enemy movement and forcing German squads into cover. Within the first hour, the attacking force had lost nearly a platoon to concentrated fire. Its advance stalled before it ever reached the base of the ridge. The crew worked in tandem, their coordination seamless from hours of preparation and repetition. One replaced spent barrels, another fed belts, while the gunner maintained a lethal rhythm that the weapon itself seemed to follow. Ammunition was rationed strategically. No round was wasted. Each enemy attempt was met with a disciplined response, exploiting both terrain and human foresight. By midday, the Germans had regrouped for a second push, attempting to flank the position along a narrower defile. Yet here too, the M1919 held. Field modifications, a slightly elevated tripod angle, and a reinforced belt feed kept the weapon firing longer than any manual had prescribed. German troops found themselves channeled into predictable paths, where the gun's overlapping fields of fire exacted maximum effect. Casualty estimates began to climb, not from exaggeration, but from careful post-engagement assessment of bodies, blood trails, and confirmed tactical halts. Fatigue weighed heavily on the gun crew, but discipline persisted. Short breaks were measured in seconds. Barrels were rotated rapidly. The cold seeped into bones, but hands remained steady. By late afternoon, enemy assaults had slowed to sporadic probing attacks. What had been predicted as an impossible hold was not only surviving, it was dictating the pace of the battle. Commanders on both sides began to recognize the unusual effectiveness of this single, reworked weapon. As the first 24 hours drew to a close, the gun had effectively disrupted repeated attacks, inflicted heavy losses, and maintained Allied control over the ridge. For the crew, there was no celebration, only the knowledge that night would come with no promise of rest, and that the Germans would return with renewed vigor. Every preparation, every adjustment, every ounce of human and mechanical endurance would be tested again. The second day began under a low, gray sky, clouds pressing down as if to weigh on the valley itself. The Germans, aware of the stubborn resistance, brought heavier fire. Mortar rounds exploded nearby, sending plumes of frozen earth into the air. Small arms fire rattled across the stone walls, punctuating the valley with sharp, staccato bursts. Yet the M1919 position held firm. The crew had anticipated this escalation, and their rhythm of operation was now second nature. Every movement, reloading, barrel rotation, observation, was rehearsed, automatic, and precise. Assaults came in waves, alternating between frontal charges and attempts to maneuver along the narrower side approaches. Each time, the gunner adjusted elevation and timing, anticipating the enemy's path. Ammunition belts were fed efficiently, and makeshift cooling techniques, rotating barrels and strategic pauses, kept the gun firing far beyond its nominal limits. German units were funneled exactly where the machine gun could dominate, their formations broken and disorganized under the relentless fire. By mid-morning, intelligence from nearby positions indicated that repeated attacks had failed to gain ground. German casualties were mounting. Estimates compiled from patrols, scouts, and battlefield observation suggested that dozens had fallen under the sustained fire of the position. While the exact number could not be verified in real time, the impact was undeniable. The enemy had stalled, their offensive momentum shattered. What had been considered impossible by doctrine, holding a vital ridge with a single modified M1919 under continuous assault, was now a demonstrated reality. The crew continued through exhaustion, aware that any lapse could be fatal. Hands blistered and numb, eyes strained to identify movement through smoke and debris, they maintained controlled bursts, conserving the weapon's integrity while maximizing lethality. Coordination with supporting riflemen and adjacent positions amplified the gun's effectiveness, allowing it to cover approaches that would otherwise have required multiple weapons. By late afternoon, repeated attacks had been repelled entirely. The ridge remained in Allied hands, and the psychological impact on both sides was evident. German units, having suffered heavy losses and failing to dislodge the defenders, began to withdraw, regroup, and reconsider further attempts. For the Allied side, the moment was grim but decisive. Endurance, preparation, and disciplined innovation had turned a theoretically impossible defensive task into a verified tactical success. As evening descended, silence returned to the ridge, broken only by the occasional distant shot and the creaking of exhausted gear. The M1919, reworked and relentlessly employed, had rewritten the assumptions of its own use, demonstrating how human ingenuity and mechanical reliability could converge under extreme conditions. From here, the battle's consequences would ripple outward, affecting strategy, morale, and the understanding of frontline weapon employment. The immediate aftermath of the engagement left a stark impression on both sides. Allied commanders documented the event in operational reports, noting the unusual effectiveness of a single machine gun position in holding the ridge for nearly 48 hours of continuous combat. Casualty estimates compiled from battlefield observation, patrols, and captured enemy notes suggested that the German forces had lost. The long-term consequences of this engagement extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. For the Allied forces, the battle served as a case study in the importance of adaptability under fire. Field reports circulated among units, emphasizing how minor modifications, careful ammunition management, and disciplined fire could allow weapons to operate beyond prescribed limits without catastrophic failure. While manuals were not officially rewritten to endorse improvised modifications, the lessons influenced how commanders train machine gun crews, stressing situational judgment and mechanical familiarity alongside doctrinal procedures. The psychological impact on both sides also persisted. Allied soldiers gained confidence in their ability to hold ground against determined assaults, recognizing that preparation, ingenuity, and endurance could offset numerical disadvantage. Conversely, German units confronted the reality that terrain, discipline, and well-placed firepower could neutralize frontal assaults that would have otherwise been considered manageable. Reports from subsequent engagements indicate increased caution in assault planning, with an emphasis on reconnaissance and flanking maneuvers to mitigate similar concentrated fire zones. Operational doctrine began to subtly absorb these lessons. While formal policy continued to advocate standard barrel changes, short bursts, and strict adherence to manuals, commanders on the ground increasingly relied on the judgment of seasoned crews. The Italian campaign, with its emphasis on rugged terrain and localized defensive action, became a proving ground for these hybrid practices, bridging official doctrine with the necessity-driven improvisation that had saved the Ridge. The event also contributed to the evolving perception of the M1919 Browning itself. Once viewed primarily as a reliable but limited support weapon, it was increasingly recognized for its potential in sustained defensive roles when managed by experienced crews. Its adaptability under stress became a point of study in training programs, emphasizing that human skill and tactical awareness could expand the capabilities of even standardized equipment. In historical hindsight, this engagement demonstrates the interplay of human decision-making, mechanical reliability, and environmental advantage. It was not a miracle weapon, nor was it a singular heroic act. It was the culmination of preparation, discipline, and situational ingenuity. The lessons learned echoed through subsequent battles, informing both the tactics of Allied forces and the caution of their opponents. What had been declared impossible, holding a vital position under relentless assault with a single modified machine gun, had been realized, leaving a legacy of practical wisdom and tactical innovation. The Ridge lay quiet at last, the valley below scarred but subdued. In the fading light, the weight of what had transpired settled over both men and machines alike. The M1919, modified in small but crucial ways, had endured, its disciplined bursts marking the line between survival and defeat. Its crew, exhausted and marked by cold, fatigue, and constant vigilance, embodied the intersection of human resilience and mechanical reliability, a lesson far more profound than any manual could convey. This engagement, measured in hours and casualties, was a microcosm of warfare itself. It demonstrated how adaptation, judgment, and endurance could reshape the expectations imposed by doctrine. The weapon did not act alone, nor did it defy nature or physics. It was a tool guided by human skill, understanding, and necessity. The line held because preparation met opportunity, and because men learned to push limits responsibly when the stakes were absolute. Historically, such moments remind us that warfare is not solely determined by numbers or strategy, but by the interplay of decision, innovation, and circumstance. Technology sets the potential, but human choice realizes it. The reworked M1919 did not perform a miracle. It fulfilled the purpose for which it was designed, amplified by the determination and ingenuity of those who wielded it. And in doing so, it left a quiet, lasting mark on tactical thought, that in the crucible of combat, what is deemed impossible may sometimes be the inevitable result of skill, courage, and circumstance. The valley, the ridge, and the weapon would be forgotten by many, yet the lessons endured, a testament not to legend, but to the disciplined, uncelebrated reality of war.